So on a follow-on work kind of that I have on the partisanship is thinking about kind of civic capital. It's not like a trust in a politician, right? It's not that I trust it's that I trust the institutions, right? So it shouldn't be partisanship. It's actually more about institutional trust and in the system. And having this trust, you would then think that by trusting the institutions, compliance then with mandates or voluntary mandates from these institutions would be higher in areas with higher civic trust. So there we do international. We can compare places in Europe, we can compare counties in the US, we have survey data, but in the US, kind of our measure of kind of civic capital is the voter participation rates around 5-6 years of elections, and in areas where people actually go out and vote at a higher rate shows that there's some trust in the system, right? Because we know from kind of economics or the median voter, that it only matters the median voter, that sometimes it seems irrational that people go out and vote. But if you assume that this intrinsic notion that you kind of value this trust in society and you maintain the system by participating in it, you kind of get this notion of a civic capital, right? And we know that civic capital leads to kind of efficiencies in contracting, because if we trust people, there's less likely that you default on lending. So there's work that shows that this civic capital is associated with like more efficient business, more compliance. And now we can kind of say, well, we can have compliance in these public health debates that we're having now, is that in the public health pandemics, where we have compliance in the sense that if you're in a high civic capital area, you kind of pay more attention to these voluntary measures. You practice more social distancing. Again, even controlling for like the political partisanship in the area, the risk factors, all these, we want to control for all these other fundamental determinants of how much you socially distance. And the interesting part there is that we can extend kind of the time series, and we can actually look all the way up until the end of April and May, almost now into June. And we can see as kind of states start opening up, right? We're relying very much on compliance now, right? We don't have any pharmaceutical cures for COVID. We don't have a vaccine yet. So a lot of this opening up of the economy is going to be based on, this voluntary compliance with social distancing, right? Wearing a mask, staying 6 feet apart. And what we observe is that in these areas where you have high civic capital, even after the state mandates that you can now start interacting, we see a muted response. So there's still very much social distancing, whereas areas that have low civic capital, there's no trust. They were already taking off, like they were already going out before the state even implemented the opening up, right? So, and that's kind of consistent. If you don't trust the system, you're like, I haven't worked, I need to go out, I can't spend another month. Whereas if you trust that the system is somewhat fair and it's giving you accurate information, you maintain the social distancing even after, because the notion is what we don't want is another peak, right? I think the nightmare becomes that we open up and then all of a sudden in August, we're back to kind of this huge hump shape, right? Another bimodal distribution where you have another spike in cases and hospitalization, right? So this notion of civic capital, again, has policy like to the extent that we can foster, trust in the system, right? By the kind of the voters, by the citizen, then it makes it easier for kind of a government to implement policy, right? Because you can think of a policymaker as having two responses. I either rely on compliance, right? I say, hey, we should be doing X, Y, and Z, or I rely on the military, right? I need to go out and basically enforce it, right? And I think a lot of our society is based on this voluntary compliance, right? We don't speed even though there's no cops around, right? Some people do, but the vast majority of us still go the speed limit even though there's no policeman in there. Right? There's a threat of a policeman that's still there. There's some enforcement, right? It's not a corner, but we still do a lot of behaviors that, that when nobody's looking, right? I think that a lot of people make this notion that, the real test of a society is that if I'm walking around and I think nobody's looking, I'm not going to go mug someone, right? I'm not going to go steal someone because I have this trust in the society and the institutions and this kind of social contract. And we kind of see that, right? So I think a lot of times we do the bleakness of like, we're divided but we still see areas that have this kind of civic capital where people have this trustingness. And I think to the extent that we harness some of that is where we can kind of get more of this kind of compliance for some of these things, and that might have longer term benefits.